History is often written by the victors, but sometimes the victors are liars. Buried beneath America's myths of freedom and democracy lies a story that few dare to tell. A story of two oppressed peoples who came together and defied an empire. A story of Africans who fled the chains of slavery and found refuge among the Seminole Nation in the swamps of Florida. Together, they forged something rare, an alliance so strong that it shook the United States military, defied presidents, and threatened the very foundation of slavery itself. They were the Black Seminoles. And America has spent 2 centuries trying to erase their name. Today, their descendants live scattered in Texas, Oklahoma, and even across the border in Mexico. They carry a legacy that America refuses to recognize, a heritage born of fire, blood, and freedom. This is not just history, this is resistance. The story begins in the 1700s, when enslaved Africans in the southern colonies began to escape bondage. Some fled into the vast, untamed swamps of Florida, at the time Spanish-controlled territory. Spain had a radical policy. Any escaped slave who reached Florida and accepted Catholicism would be granted freedom. For the enslaved, this was more than a legal loophole. It was a chance to live. Here, they encountered the Seminoles, a confederation of native peoples, themselves refugees of displacement. The Seminoles had splintered from the Creek, migrating south into Florida's wilderness. They were already skilled fighters and survivors. Instead of rejecting the escaped Africans, the Seminoles welcomed them. They intermarried, shared food, fought alongside one another, and created a hybrid community. This was more than survival. It was a political statement to peoples that America wanted to erase. Africans and natives stood together and said, "We will not bow." The United States hated this alliance. Slaveholders in Georgia and South Carolina saw the Black Seminoles as a direct threat, living proof that enslaved Africans could escape, resist, and survive without white masters. So, the U.S. declared war. The First Seminole War erupted in 1816, when Andrew Jackson marched troops into Florida. His goal was simple: destroy the Black Seminole communities, capture escaped slaves, and crush Seminole resistance. But the swamps fought back, and the Seminoles fought like ghosts. The Black Seminoles became legendary guerrilla warriors. They knew the terrain, they struck with precision, and they refused to surrender. White generals were stunned. How could escaped slaves and native warriors humiliate the U.S. Army? Among them rose a leader whose name should be as famous as Frederick Douglass or Sitting Bull, John Horse, also called Juan Caballo. John Horse was not just a warrior. He was a strategist, a diplomat, and a visionary. He led Black Seminoles through battles, negotiated with U.S. officials, and refused to accept re-enslavement. During the Second Seminole War, 1835 to 1842, John Horse became the face of resistance. He allied with the Seminole war chief Osceola, and together they led the longest and most expensive native war in U.S. history. The U.S. spent millions, deployed thousands of soldiers, and still could not defeat them. Newspapers at the time described it as a national embarrassment. And here's the part America doesn't like to admit. The Black Seminoles were fighting not just for native land, but for black freedom. If they won, slavery itself was threatened. But America is not just an empire of guns. It is an empire of betrayal. After years of bloodshed, U.S. officials promised John Horse and his people freedom if they agreed to relocate west. Exhausted, they agreed. But once in Oklahoma, the U.S. tried to break its word, pushing Black Seminoles back into slavery under Creek and Cherokee slaveholders. Once again, John Horse refused, and once again, his people resisted. Facing betrayal, John Horse led hundreds of Black Seminoles on one of the most remarkable journeys in history, across the border into Mexico. In 1850, John Horse and about 300 followers crossed into Mexico, where slavery had been abolished. The Mexican government welcomed them, even hiring them as border guards against Apache raiders. Here, the Black Seminoles found what America refused to give: freedom, land, and dignity. They built villages in northern Mexico, blending African, Seminole, and Mexican traditions. Even today, their descendants, known as the Mascogos, live in Coahuila, preserving songs, dances, and stories passed down for generations. Not all remained in Mexico. Some eventually returned to Texas, where they became famous as the Black Seminole Scouts of the U.S. Army. Irony dripped from their rifles. The same America that once hunted them now used them as soldiers against other native tribes. In Oklahoma, descendants of the Black Seminoles still struggle for recognition within the Seminole Nation. Tribal politics, racism, and the legacy of slavery complicate their fight. Many Seminole freedmen, Black descendants, once enslaved by Seminoles, are excluded from tribal citizenship to this very day. Imagine that. People whose ancestors fought alongside the Seminoles for survival are told they don't belong. Here's the controversial truth. America does not want you to remember the Black Seminoles. Why? Because their story destroys the national myth. America tells us slavery was unbreakable, but the Black Seminoles broke it. America tells us Native Americans were destined to vanish, but the Seminoles survived. America tells us resistance is futile, but the Black Seminoles proved resistance works. To remember them is to expose America as an empire built on lies. And that is why textbooks remain silent. The story of the Black Seminoles is not just history, it's prophecy. They showed that when oppressed peoples unite, they become unstoppable. They proved that the color line, drawn by colonizers, could be broken by solidarity. Today, in an America still divided by race, their legacy challenges us. What if Black and Native communities stood together again? What if we refused to let history divide us?